Welcome to Two Therapists Talking. The hope for this podcast is to talk about important issues related to couples and individuals who are struggling in their lives with many different issues. I'm David Thompson, a marriage and family therapist.
And I'm Sherie Christensen, marriage and family therapist. Please join us as we explore these issues together, and we hope you will learn and be enlightened along the way. Come find us at twotherapisttalking.com. If you like what you're hearing, please get on and rate us and subscribe to the podcast. Hi, welcome back to Two Therapists Talking. I'm Sherie.
And I'm David.
And we are doing a second episode on comorbid conditions with sexual addiction. So if you haven't listened to our first episode on this, which is our most recent one, go back and give that a listen. But to just sort of briefly recap what we were talking about, it is that with sexual addiction, we often see other things going on.
Right.
It's not all the time, but there can definitely be other things going on. And when there are other things going on, that's the comorbid, that's together. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that we're addressing them, because if we don't, again, it is going to cause a lot more issues in terms of you being able to, or your partner being able to recover and maintain sobriety and sexual addiction, and for the relationship to also do well.
Right. And again, this may be why people who have worked recovery, let's say, for a very long time, seem unable to sort of figure it out.
Yeah.
Because there's just other factors here that probably are pretty impactful that maybe we haven't looked at or addressed.
Right. And if you listen to our last episode, and we were talking about depression being one of those conditions, you can start to get a sense for how complicated the human psyche is, right? It's just very complicated. And because of that, with sexual addiction being a coping mechanism, a kind of surface thing that's going on, you've got to be able to get underneath that and really see, okay, why? Why are people acting outside of their value system? What is going on underneath? And again, the 12-step program is a great way to do that. But if it's an actual mental health condition, you've got to have a therapist in there doing that work and helping you to kind of pull those pieces apart, see what it is, and address that.
Right.
So, and again, when we do that, you see huge shifts in people's capacity to move forward in their recovery and sobriety journey.
Yep.
So,
which I know what you're thinking right about now. You're thinking, so why haven't we heard about this before or sooner? We're on episode, I don't know what.
How many?
100.
I know we were just thinking that. How have we not done an episode on this yet?
Like we're doing everyone a disservice here.
Yes, it is a big
120 episodes in, and now we're talking about other important factors. Yeah, yes. Okay.
And hopefully you've been working with a therapist, and, therapists are they're trained to kind of look at those things. Therapy, it's designed to kind of look at some of these things. So hopefully that is something that's being done already, that you're kind of considering these things. But again, we want to talk about it because maybe you aren't doing therapy yet, or maybe you've been working hard and you've really been focusing on sexual addiction and recovery, and you're just feeling stuck, and it just feels like things aren't quite shifting. Maybe you can consider that there might be something else going on and check on that.
Yep.
So last time we talked about depression, we started with that. And going along with depression, we just really briefly also want to touch on bipolar. Bipolar is a mood disorder, and it is characterized by periods of depression and then periods of hypomania or mania. And what that, I think a lot of people sort of have a grounding sense of understanding of what that is. So we won't go into tons of detail about that, but it is a space of being very elevated, having a lot of grandiose ideas. I'm going to conquer the world. I'm going to do all these amazing things. I don't need to I don't need to spend a lot of time sleeping or a lot of times this. I'm going to just do all the things, but not able to really follow through on the back end of that space.
Right.
And then falling back into some depression. So there's nuances around that and what that can look like, but that's just kind of a really brief touch on this is what bipolar can look like.
And Sherie, why would it be really important to know that bipolar is comorbid?
Because if you have that at the same time, you're going to have a lot of struggles if you're not addressing the bipolar. You're going to have a lot of struggles gaining traction in your addictive recovery process, right? If you're feeling really depressed a lot of the times, and then you have these spurts where you're like, I'm doing all the things, I can do this and I can do that, and I'm going to be the best recovered addict in the world, and you've got all of these other things going on, then and then you go back into the depression. You're just going to cycle through that, and you're not going to be able to have some stability. And mood disorders are things that you treat with medication. So just like with the depression, which I don't actually know if we touched on that and talked medication with depression. I think it's pretty common knowledge that that's what
usually,
you do.
Right? Yeah.
With depression, but just in case someone was wondering, if you have major depressive disorder and whatever, it's likely that you're going to need some SSRIs, other mood type stabilizers, to help you to get through that. Even if it's temporary, you still probably need to do that. So again, with bipolar as a mood disorder, this is something that you can stabilize with SSRIs. You can stabilize with lithium. Taking both of those together, that can really help even things out, so you have a better baseline to work with. And bipolar is something that gets worse over time. So if you don't start treating that with the medication and therapy and things like that, that will just actually progressively get worse over time.
Right.
So,
in other words, we talked last episode a little bit about maybe order of importance.
Yes.
And again, not that we want to give a free pass to acting out or addiction. It really depends on what the acting out behavior is. But in the case of something like bipolar, we really got to focus on bipolar and making progress.
You've got to focus on getting that stabilized. And again, remember that this actually is progress toward addiction recovery.
Right.
Because as you stabilize pre-existing or comorbid conditions, it's automatically going to ease the recovery process. It's going to make it easier to do. Great
point to think about and remember. Yep.
So that's bipolar. And again, if you've got an up and a down and an up and a down, it makes it really challenging to maintain consistency, to regulate. And when that down is actually depression, again, that also makes it challenging to get out of bed, even to do the things that you need to do to move forward and create a good environment to recover. So definitely want to work on that and get that treated. Anxiety is the next one we want to talk about. That's very often comorbid. And again, this is where therapy is needed for both depression, depression and anxiety, to determine, is this a feeling that's starting to come up because of what's going on with sexual addiction? Is this a deeper, more long-standing pattern? But anxiety is definitely something that we see, right? Yeah. The more anxious that you are running around in your life all the time, constantly worrying, constantly feeling a lot of panic or distress, addiction is a fantastic Band-Aid for that. It's a fantastic coping skill.
Right. And you imagine taking that coping skill away from someone who's still highly anxious.
Yes.
It's sort of taking this security away and leaving what exactly in return.
Yes.
Which can be very, very hard.
It can be incredibly challenging. But then on the flip side, if you don't recognize that you have that and you are just working so hard to not act out, but you're feeling all of these huge high levels of anxious distress, it's just going to be really hard. It's going to be hard to stay motivated. It's going to be hard to move through that process.
Very hard.
And I've definitely talked to other colleagues and things that where if you have an anxious, a very someone who has anxiety that needs to be medicated, you get them medicated, and suddenly a lot of the reason why they're acting out is just gone, right?
Yeah.
When we look at underlying things that are going on, and you're working your steps, and you're in your step 4, and you're trying to figure out your character defects and different things like that, some of those are going to take some substantial work. We're not saying that just, popping a pill makes you forever not anxious, right? But if you don't have the chemicals in your brain that it needs, just like with depression, just like bipolar, if you don't have the chemicals in your brain that your brain needs, you can be working your tail off on other things, even on things, okay, I need to not worry as much. I need to not be depressed as much. It's not going to go very well. But if we can get your brain what it needs, then suddenly everything just becomes much, much easier.
Right. And imagine the benefit, right, of medication that's helping chemically. And then also for a time, however long in therapy, you're focused on depression or anxiety treatment with, CBT and other things. Now you can see some real progress in other areas. And that's what we want to have happen for you. So,
yes. So certainly make sure that, with these conditions, especially these conditions that need medication to stabilize, or it helps tremendously to do that you don't forget to consider the medication. And I think along the same lines, OCD is related to anxiety in those ways, and medication can help with that. OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, and we can see that sometimes in addiction. And the thing that's interesting, I think, about obsessive compulsive disorder is that it can actually, if it's not treated and you don't have the skills and the tools related specifically to that disorder, we can actually end up seeing issues with being extra obsessed with recovery.
yeah.
So I've had clients that have landed on that side of things where everything now revolves around each individual thing, and they get a lot of obsessive thoughts and a lot of obsessive behaviors that are related to recovery things.
Yeah. Which is easy to do because there's so many steps and so many things. And,
yes. Yeah. But when it's over the top, and now we've got an obsessive need to share every tiny little way that I might have been considering thinking about acting out, and then it leads to a lot of oversharing. It leads to like obsessively thinking about the program, or maybe not being able to work the program well.
Ruminating if you did it right, if you looked too long, if you were lusting too much today, going over and over and over certain situations.
Yes, it can completely take over. And then we're not actually doing recovery work.
Right.
It feels like recovery work, but boy, we're not doing recovery work.
Right.
And then the spouse can actually get pretty bombarded with, oversharing and over disclosing, even whether or not it's something that actually needs to be disclosed. It can just get to these really heightened levels that make it really complicated to actually get recovery work done.
Right.
So again, getting medication, getting the skills and tools and understanding related to obsessive compulsive disorder can actually then really help the client to be able to maintain more sobriety and really work through recovery in an effective way. So the next one we want to talk about is ADHD. And this one is really important to talk about with addiction because it is very commonly comorbid, and the ways that ADHD affects us and affect you when you have addiction is really, it's a really critical thing to work on.
It really is. Yep.
And ADHD is not, everybody knows what this is, right? But sometimes we think of it as an inability to focus. Like you just can't focus. but it's
And you
not
need to just try
that.
harder to focus.
Yes,
right?
yes. It's an inability to regulate focus. So actually, they can focus incredibly well on certain things
Right.
and at certain times. And then in other times, they can't seem to focus at all. So they can't regulate and kind of bring it to a middle ground. And ADHD is a dopamine deficiency. And that affects your executive functioning, right? ADHD affects your executive functioning where you can't process things the same way. Again, remember, executive functioning is all in your prefrontal cortex. That's all your decision making. It's your ability to regulate impulse control, right? Can you kind of see how this is super important when you're talking about addiction?
Yeah.
If you can't regulate impulse control, you can want to work recovery and you can want to stay sober all you want. But if you can't control that impulse, those impulses when they come up for something that's going to provide you with high dopamine, there's no way you're not going to succeed.
Right.
It's really going to be impossible to maintain that over time if you have ADHD. You've got to get the medication to stabilize that, to give you the capacity to have impulse control, the capacity to have the dopamine in your body that you need, that if you just naturally run at a deficit, you just need to have that brought up to a normal level.
Right.
And if you think about that in terms of, then it makes a ton of sense that people with ADHD had a astronomically higher risk for any type of addictive or a reckless, impulsive kinds of activities and behaviors, because they don't have a stable level of dopamine. They're running at a deficiency. So doing things that give them a high level of dopamine are actually their body's way of trying to cope with and get some stability, get some normalcy in what their body needs. Right? What anybody needs, because they're running at a deficit. And so, but then you throw impulsivity in there, and then you've got a big mess, right? So again, you've got to treat this. You've got to get on medication. You've got to gain the coping skills and tools to understand what it is, to take care of it, or you really don't have much of a chance when you're moving forward with recovery.
And I'm sure many of you who are listening to this are thinking, yeah, this makes total sense. Mm-hmm. And it comes together, which, we just finished our episodes on what to do if you're the addict or if you're the spouse. And we talk about learning. We talk about understanding addiction. We talk about empathy, self-evaluation. Well, hopefully all of this is helping to put this into focus even better.
Right.
So if your partner struggles with depression or anxiety or any of these ADHD, you see why we want to approach this so kind of cautiously, but also compassionately, because how many other things are factors in why it's hard for them to not only not act out, but to go through recovery.
Right.
And do all the things that everybody's asking them to do. So hopefully this is generating a little more kindness
and understanding
and empathy for partners in addiction.
For sure. Yeah. And again, with ADHD, you do want to get medicated and get that figured out, but there's still going to be coping skills you need to develop, because it will make it a lot easier to have impulse control, but there will still be times that are hard to have impulse control, especially when you're not an ADHD medication you may be familiar with, but you have to get off of, you have to have it come out of your body in order for you to be able to go to bed at night, right? And so most of your dosages are going to end you in the evening, or somewhere between 4 and 8 o'clock at night. And that's necessary, or it can make it more challenging to sleep.
Yeah.
So that means that for a lot of people who struggle with addiction, a lot of people are acting out in the evening. And that can be a challenging time that people fall into that pattern of acting out at that time.
Yeah.
So you're not gonna have medication at that time. You're going to have to still be learning the tools and learning the skills of getting yourself in a position to continue to have sobriety. So again, with lots of these, medication is going to be super helpful.
Right.
But you still are going to need to be aware
skills.
of it
Yep.
and still learn skills and tools specific to your particular diagnosis that are going to give you that leg up to continue moving forward in recovery really well. Okay, the next one we want to address is autism. Autism is a big thing to try to talk about in a small space here, but I think it's important to just touch on briefly because we do have a number of people who are high functioning autistic that kind of made it through without getting diagnosed. And autism is now considered to be on the same spectrum as ADHD. It's kind of at the end, it's beyond kind of the end of the spectrum there. And so there are a few things that can look similar, or if you are very strongly have ADHD and things still seem a little off, you may also want to consider this. I've definitely worked with people who have realized, oh wow, you're actually very ADHD. They get that treated, you're working on those kinds of things. And over time, as you're kind of working through additional things, realizing, oh, actually there's some autism here.
Yeah.
Again, super important because there are a lot of things about autism that can make it challenging to recovery, challenging to move forward in recovery. So different things around really rigid thinking patterns, all or nothing thinking patterns, and also this learned capacity that has to be developed to really see things through other people's perspective. And one of the reasons I also wanted to mention this is because sometimes people with high functioning autism are seen as being narcissistic, especially if they're older. So they've had a lot of time to learn and build the skills and tools that make them not look as socially awkward. They've figured some of those things out. They've learned how to mask in some of those ways. And then they have addiction, and we get into this space, and it may look like they're a narcissist. It may look like they're being selfish in that way, to the point where they maybe have NPD. And the difference here that's really critically important to pull apart, and that makes all the difference in looking at this, is that if you have high functioning autism, you struggle to see through other people's perspectives, understand what other people who are in the situation might be experiencing. They struggle with perspective taking. NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is an inability to feel empathy. And it's weird that you may go, why is she even saying this? Like, why are we even talking about this? But it actually is something that we see, that people will not recognize that someone is actually high functioning autistic as opposed to narcissistic, because they're just struggling to see the perspective that the other person is taking. They're just really struggling. They have to think about it actively. Right. Whereas they do actually have quite a bit of empathy and can feel very deeply for other people and their circumstances. So if there's a consideration, or if you're thinking, wow, my partner is, super narcissistic, there actually may be something else going on as well. So again, something super important to have a therapist go into and be aware of, and pulling apart the different pieces. There's obviously a lot more differences, but I have seen that in enough instances that I feel like it's important to note here.
Yeah.
That it can look like just someone being very selfish, or someone being a narcissist or something like that. But when we actually get in there and pull all the pieces apart with a therapist, you can actually see that it's different. They actually have high functioning autism. they have all these other characteristics, and they are just struggling to try to see the perspective of the other person, but they want to,
Right.
and they want to connect,
And they can.
And they can.
With help and skills and practice and,
Yes. It's just something that they have to have the experience of going through and having those skills and taught and all of that. So again, that probably feels a little like thrown out there from left field a little bit, but without talking about it for 3 or 4 hours and really pulling it apart, it's kind of challenging to navigate. But I did want to say something about that, because it does happen, and those two can get conflated.
I'm sure you can appreciate what Sherie is sharing and helping us to see the differences.
Mm-hmm. And I throw that in there again because the next thing that we're going to talk about is personality disorders, really touching briefly on them. We've actually done a number of episodes on both narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, and we've talked about those and how those can show up in addiction and what needs to be done in those cases and all of that. And so we just want to, again, remind you that personality disorders are often comorbid with addiction. Not that tons of people with addiction have personality disorders, but if you have a personality disorder, it's pretty likely that you could have an addiction.
Yeah.
Because again, it's a really good coping skill for personality disorders. Are things that are inherent in their personality, that it's extremely challenging to change, and they're struggling with understanding why other people, like why life isn't going particularly well for them, right? It's just like autism and some of the other things. And so you want to make sure that some of those things are being addressed. So again, narcissistic personality disorder, we've talked about that a lot. Most people have a general idea of what that is. Borderline personality disorder, that's a big buzzword as well. And if you want more information on what that is, go back and listen to our episodes. We'll actually talk about the diagnostic criteria for both of those disorders and go into a ton of detail about how they are involved with addiction and the specific treatments and different things that are involved with those. But I do want to touch on one other one, which is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is different than obsessive compulsive disorder, which is what everybody always thinks of. But obsessive compulsive personality disorder is, in a nutshell, a way of being very rigid in thinking patterns and obsessed with certain ways of doing things. So oftentimes there's scrupulosity involved quite a bit, which is related to a strong rigidity around religion. And it also involves being rigid around a lot of other, and inflexible around a lot of other types of patterns and behaviors. These people with this personality disorder often really rigid around money, really rigid around not spending money, and not and maybe like stocking up on like different other things like end of the world disaster related types of things. They can be very rigid around that.
So, right, what Sherie is sharing is absolutely true. What you often see with this OCPD, they're very preoccupied with order and control and perfectionism. And
very rigid that way.
Very rigid. There's their way of doing things, and it's really hard to compromise with others. It's kind of a my way or the highway situation.
Right.
And so obsessions, perfectionism, rigidity, difficulty with relationships because they're so inflexible, it just makes it hard.
Right.
Same with work, completing tasks, maintaining relationships. And they also tend to be very self-critical. And they have very rigid moral principles that they apply to themselves and others.
The scrupulosity and stuff. It has to look exactly this way. So as we're looking at that, you can see how that could be really challenging with addiction. Either they might berate themselves like horribly because they're not measuring up to this standard of moral conduct. They also might get super rigid in how they try to do their recovery program in a very all or nothing perfectionistic kind of way, which could then lead to a lot of problems because who does everything perfect all the time, right?
Right.
But it also could lead to them just obsessing over, again, the amount of time that they're spending doing all of these things and getting really stuck in those patterns. And again, relationship is not going to get better unless that's worked on and figured out, and the two, they're able to develop some coping skills so they can be a little bit more flexible in their relationship with their partner.
Right. And that's why it's so important to understand these, because we need the space often to sort of set the addiction aside and focus on some of these other things. And we want understanding for the partners that, this may not look like the steps, the work, the groups, all these things.
Right.
But what we're doing is we're trying to relieve these other symptoms and often get at the underlying cause, which is more important than what it looks like treating just addiction. And so very important for everybody to understand this, whether you're identifying this for yourself or for a partner. Really important to talk to a therapist about and say, hey, I'm wondering if maybe we need to explore some other causes here.
For sure.
If I'm hitting the same wall over and over and over.
Yeah. Yes. Or if as we move into this, other things arise or things just seem to get really challenging. Yep. We really want to make sure, again, that we're treating the whole everything, right? And not just the surface coping skill.
Right.
That we're getting into what's going on underneath, making sure that all of that is taken care of. In addition to what you're looking at in your step 4 of underlying causes and character defects and things like that, we really want to look at overall mental health and make sure we're addressing, again, anything that could end up standing in your way of developing that addiction recovery, the sobriety, becoming your best 2.0 version of yourself, and having the relationship get to that 2.0 version of itself. So, and again, I think we can also just throw out there really briefly that this is important, again, for spouses as well, right?
Yeah.
Because any of these things we've talked about, obviously talked about them in terms of how it can affect addiction and addiction recovery, but it also, all of these things have large consequences on healing and how you're showing up in relationship regarding betrayal and the trauma that can feel like in your life.
Right.
So making sure that we're treating, if a spouse has depression or anxiety or OCD about what they or their spouse is doing in recovery, or a personality disorder, autism, all of these things, ADHD, can actually really affect the partner's ability to heal and move forward in relationship as well. So definitely we want to look at that for both partners. And sometimes that doesn't really come out until you're in a little bit. So if you've been going and you've been working and you've been doing these things, and then something starts to come out, or you're starting to notice that you're stuck or whatever, and you get in there and you figure out, oh, I have this other thing, or my partner has this other thing, that's okay. Sometimes it can feel frustrating to not know right away. How did we not see this forever long ago, right? But if you're both in a ton of distress about a recently exposed addiction, and you're trying to get, your needs met, you're trying to figure out what's the path forward, and addiction is going to feel like the biggest thing on the plate, right? It's going to feel like it's sort of taking over. And as you start working on things and getting a little bit more comfortable and familiar with the process, then oftentimes that's when some of these start to come up, because we're noticing you're getting stuck, or we're noticing that you're really struggling to have to do the things you need to do, or you're feeling extra anxious, or maybe you're feeling extra and you won't know because this is how you do life, right? Like, this is just how I go through my life. But when you're working with a therapist, then they can start seeing things like, oh, wait a minute, you seem extra anxious, and as we work on that, you seem to not be able to navigate that still.
Right.
Something that someone else who doesn't have an anxiety disorder would be able to kind of walk through in a minute or two. Oh, okay, yeah, I can kind of calm down about that. If you can't do that, then we need to start paying attention to some of those patterns. So sometimes it really is a moving forward and working on the addiction, working on addiction recovery, and then noticing over time, oh, wait a minute, we got some other patterns that we're now seeing as we're kind of clearing through and working on things. So this may be something that comes up over time, and that's also okay.
Right.
But we definitely want to make sure we're addressing things when they do come up. So I hope that was helpful to kind of get an overview and see that we really want to make sure we're taking it seriously to look at comorbid issues, pre-existing conditions, to address those, to make sure we're working in therapy and considering those types of things so that you can be as effective as possible as you're moving through recovery, as you're moving through sobriety, gaining sobriety, and repairing relationship.
I am sure this was a really helpful episode that's in the last one, so I'm glad you could join us.
Yeah, we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for listening to Two Therapists Talking. We look forward to sharing more conversations with you. Connect with us at twotherapisttalking.com or email podcast@twotherapisttalking.com. If you like what you're hearing, please get on and rate us and subscribe to the podcast.